We did the material about those sacrificing to their standards. I will take my stand on the watchtower and spy out. And the Lord answered, write down a vision, make it plain on tablets, so that you can read it on the run. Habakkuk 2:1 and 2:2. All this is going to be interpreted. Here's how it's interpreted, column 7. God told Habakkuk what to write down, what was going to happen in the last generation. We're in the last times. But he did not inform them when that age would end. And concerning what was said about reading and writing in the previous vision, it concerns the righteous teacher, to whom God made known all the mysteries of the words of his servants, the prophets. That's exactly what they say about the priest, you see, in column 2. So we know, in line 8 of column 2, God put in his heart the discernment to interpret all the words of his servants, the prophets. So we know the priest and the righteous teacher are the same person. He made known all the mysteries, so he can interpret Scripture. For there shall yet be a vision of the appointed time, and he will speak it, and he will not lie. The interpretation of this is that the last era, or the last times, will be extended and exceed anything the prophets have foretold. Here they're giving up hope of an immediate coming of the last times and the end time. This, in Christianity, is a known thing. Plus they give the prophetical passage, Habakkuk 2:3, we're about to come to what? The most famous passage in all Christian history, Habakkuk 2:4. The passage that Paul uses to base all his theology on. This extension of the last times beyond anything the prophets have foretold, as the mysteries of God are astounding, is known in church theology after the death of Christ, and the last times did not come. It's called the delay of the parousia. If it tarries, you should wait. This concerns the men of truth, the doers of the Torah, whose hand shall not slacken from the service of the truth, though the final age be prolonged before them. And you're to do this, though the last days are to be extended, because, you know, the Messianic kingdom is not coming. Behold, his soul is puffed up. Here, it's that someone's sins will be doubled upon them at the last judgment. They will not be pleased with their judgment. So at the last, that's what the puffed up means here. And the righteous shall live by his faith. The interpretation of this, column 8, concerns the doers of the Torah, again, just like the delay of the parousia in Habakkuk 2:3. But look at this. All the doers of the Torah in the house of Judah. House of Judah is an archaic way of saying Jews. That is, it only concerns Torah doers in the house of Judah. Torah doing Jews, whom God will save because of their works and their faith in the righteous teacher. That's basically what James is saying in chapter 2. We're saved by works. The word is amal, A-M-A-L. It comes from Isaiah 53, the passage that all Christians relate to Jesus. And it relates to, through his suffering works, really, is what it's about. My servant, the righteous one, will justify many, is what Isaiah 53:11 says. In any case, it does not concern non-doers of the Torah in the house of Judah. And it certainly does not concern non-doers of the Torah outside the house of Judah. So I think that this is definitely framed with knowledge of the Pauline Gentile mission and how the Pauline Gentile mission is interpreting Habakkuk 2:4. That it's applying to non-Torah doers outside the house of Judah. That's how Paul uses it. To say, hey, don't take the law on yourselves. The law is a curse, he says. The law brings death. Jesus brings life. Faith in Christ Jesus saves. Okay, it may be true. I'm not saying it isn't true. All I'm saying is that this group, I think, shows awareness that that interpretation is circulating. And they are saying, no, it only concerns Torah doers in the house of Judah. It does not concern Torah doers outside the house of Judah. It doesn't even concern non-Torah doers in the house of Judah. That's what I think they're saying. That's very important. In any case, just the idea that Habakkuk 2:4 is here is... Okay, now we get to the wicked priests. Woe to the man who multiplies himself, that which is not his, how long will he continue to burden himself? This interpretation concerns the wicked priest, who in the beginning was called by the name of truth, but when he ruled Israel, his heart, back to the other illusion, became puffed up, and he deserted God and betrayed the laws for the sake of riches. There's lots of those in the 50s and 60s AD that Josephus tells us about. And he stole and collected the riches of the men of violence who rebelled against God. And he took the riches of the peoples. Now, I think this means the violent ones that the high priest sent out to the servant floors in the 60s to beat the poor lower priests. So this, he took the riches of the peoples. I think it means he took it as gifts to the temple. I think this is Ananus, he's in your Josephus. Anyway, he heaped upon himself that punishment that would be doubled, the word puffed up, and he acted in all the ways of abomination and all unclean pollutions. Tortures arise. Again, this concerns the priest, but not our priest, the wicked priest, who rebelled against the laws of God. Okay, that's the wicked priest, the Herodian priesthood in my view. Column 9. They inflicted upon him the judgments upon evil and the outrages of evil pollutions, taking vengeance upon the flesh of his corpse. In fact, the word givaot, which is in the Hebrew, is corpse. Now, if you look carefully, when the zealots take over and they destroy Ananus, Josephus says they rebuked him, his corpse, his naked corpse. But the main thing is, he says they threw his naked corpse outside the city without burial as food for jackals. That's how much they hated this person. Well, why did they hate him so much? What did he have? What had he done? He was the one involved in the death of James. In my view, one thing brings about another thing. These people, these so-called, this is the first time Josephus is using the word zealot. It's in the Jewish war. Yeah.
No, sir. And okay, Ananus' involvement in bringing about the death of James, is that a disputed fact?
No, that's good.
That's
interesting. It's the antiquities. According to the Gospels, his father, first Ananus, this is Ananus ben Ananus, about how Jonathan, his brother, was assassinated by the Sicarii in the 50s, when the Sicarii first appear, according to Josephus. And who's the first person they assassinated? Jonathan, the son of Ananus, the high priest. And then this Ananus, son of Ananus, takes over, and he's appointed by Agrippa II. And then he just, the only thing he does is bring James up for a Sanhedrin trial for blasphemy, supposedly, has him executed. And Josephus says the most righteous of the Jews objected to what was done. And then the zealots destroy them. So I say group the like groups by who their enemies are. Now what's going on here? They took vengeance on the flesh of his corpse. As for words, you spoiled many nations. The additional ones of the peoples, you see, the peoples, to my mind, are the Herodians. The additional ones of the peoples, what's called the Yeter Ha'amim, will plunder you. That is, the additional ones of the peoples are the Romans. Peoples is like ethnon in Greek. Gentiles, as it's called in the New Testament. Ethnon in English is Gentiles. Peoples, amim in Hebrew, is a parallel to ethnon in Greek. So the additional ones of the people, they will plunder you. This concerns the last priests of Jerusalem, plural high priest clans, as in the Herodian period. What do you mean? The Maccabees are the last priests of Jerusalem? I don't think so. Who are the last priests of Jerusalem? And how do they know? The Herodian priesthood. And the priestly clans as delineated in the Gospels. And what did they do? In my translation, and I think I'm more correct than Vermesh, they profiteered from the spoils of the peoples. That is, that the peoples were the bully boys, the tax collectors, the Herodians and the Romans and their soldiers. They were the ones collecting spoils from among the people, and they profiteered from this in the temple establishment that they ran, the Herodian priesthood. This has nothing to do with the Maccabees. How did the Maccabees profiteer from the spoils of the people? How are they the last priests of Jerusalem? And again, my colleagues don't interpret text, they just look at coin data and paleography. But in the last days, their riches, together with their booty, will be given over to the hand of the army of the Kittim. They are the Yeter Hamim, and it says it. So we know that the Yeter Hamim are the Romans, the additional, because they are the additional ones of the people. That can't be more specific. Now, we know for a fact, according to Josephus, that Pompey, when he took the temple, did not take plunder. Herod, when he took the temple, according to Josephus, maybe it's a lie, paid the soldiers out of his own pocket so he wouldn't alienate the people totally. Only in 70 AD did the Roman armies plunder the temple and take all the booty that the high priest had in Mass, took it to Rome and built the Colosseum. And the Flavians built the Colosseum with the money that they got from this. So that looks like this is written after the fall of the temple. So their riches, the last priests, plural priestly clans, were given over to the army of the Kittim. There's only one time that happened, that's 78 AD. Now, they said it will happen. They don't necessarily say that they saw it happen, but by 68 it was a foregone conclusion. Now look at the rest of this. Because of the blood of men, the violence done to the land, the township and all its inhabitants. This interpretation concerns the wicked priest. Again, that's all they're interested now in. The wicked priest, they're very worked up about him because of what he did to the righteous teacher. And they're also worked up, we'll see, about the liar, who doesn't seem to be the same person as the wicked priest. Because he's not in the community, the wicked priest. The liar is. And the liar, remember, denied the law in the midst of the whole congregation. As a consequence of the evil he did to the righteous teacher and the men of his council, God delivered to the hand, and antiquities say that Ananus killed James and a few of his associates. Because of the evil did to the righteous teacher and the men of his council, God delivered him in the hand of his enemies to afflict him with torture, to consume him with bitterness, because he condemned his elect. Again, I just call attention to how Ananus died. I don't know who else was tortured in that fashion, or whose body was abused like that you can point to. Column 10, its interpretation concerns the house of judgment. There, house of judgment was the same for Habakkuk 2:4. Remember, God will save them from the house of judgment because of their faith and their works. This concerns the house of judgment which God will deliver. It's the same word. God delivers the house of judgment in his judgment in the midst of many peoples. God will be in the last judgment, deliver his, in Hebrew it's called a beit mishpat, a judgment. It's house of judgment, but it's actually the act of delivering judgment. And he will arraign him, the wicked priest, at that time, and condemn him in their midst, and judge him with fire and brimstone. This is a picture of the last judgment and hell. Going to consign him to hell. Doesn't sound like much to us, but that's what it is. Woe to the person who builds a city on blood. Here's that blood thing we heard about in the Nahum commentary. The interpretation of this passage is about the spouter of lying. Oh, we're back to this other person, the man of lying, the spouter of lying. We had him in the Damascus document. Now we're back to him. I don't think he's the wicked priest. He's an internal adversary. Vermesh says, I say that these two are the same, and therefore it can't be a Paul because he's not a priest. I don't say the spouter of lying has anything to do with the wicked priest. It's a totally different person, and it's a different problem. He leads many astray with his lying, whereas the righteous teacher does what? Justifies the many, the rank and file, as Isaiah 53:11 says, as Jesus does in Christianity. What did he do? He built a worthless city upon blood and erected an assembly or congregation or church upon lying. For the sake of his own glorification, tiring out many with a worthless service and instructing them in works of lying, so that their, again, amal, the same amal that we heard you should will save you, their amal, their works, their suffering works, would be for emptiness or count for nothing. It actually says would be empty. And also in James 2:20, James says to its opponent, "Oh, you empty man. Oh, you empty man. Don't you know that Abraham was justified by works too?" So he uses this allusion to empty to refer to his Pauline type adversary. Now that may or may not hold water, but there's a lot of parallels. Anyway, there's nothing else you can draw a parallel to of any of this. So if it's not that, I don't know what else it is. So if you ever think of something better, that's fine. That's the best I can do. They will be brought to the same judgments of fire, that's the last hellfire, with which they either blasphemed or wished upon or vilified the elect of God. Anyway, the earth will be filled with knowledge and glory of God like the waters covering the sea. The interpretation of the passages, etc., etc., etc. It's a bit broken here. One to one who causes his neighbor to drink, pouring out fury in his drunkenness in order to look upon their festivals. In the actual Habakkuk that we have, 2:15, it says, look upon their privy parts. So they've changed this, or it's different, to look upon their festivals, probably on purpose. In fact, festivals and privy parts is a similar word in Hebrew. I think there's one consonant different. Anyway, back to the wicked priest. This concerns the wicked priest who pursued the righteous teacher in order to swallow him in his hot anger in or with his house of exile. Now, everyone says, oh, the righteous teacher was in a house of exile somewhere. But in Hebrew, the hises are never clear who they relate to. So we have a series of hises. He pursued after him, him is the same word as his in Hebrew. So we have the first one is him or his, and that relates clearly to the righteous teacher. The second his, in his hot anger, that's not the righteous teacher, that's the wicked priest. So what's the third his? The wicked priest or the righteous teacher? In all of the house, his house of exile, or exiled house, and everyone assumes that Qumran is where the wicked priest went on Yom Kippur, as we'll see, to swallow him. I say that in fact, exiled house has to do with words in the Talmud that speak about how in the period from the time around the death of Jesus to the fall of the temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled from its house of sitting on the Temple Mount in the stone chamber to a location outside the Temple Mount. Now, I don't know why it was exiled. So it's talked about in the Talmud as the exiled house. Its house of exile, because it was no longer sitting on the Temple Mount in this period. That's in 7 places in the Talmud. So I say that what we're talking about is the Sanhedrin trial, and that they won't even dignify it with a name. So they call it his exiled house, and that's where he swallowed him. Because at the completion of the festival of rest of the Day of Atonement, he appeared to them to swallow them, causing them to stumble on their fast day. And this is very obscure, but something happened on the Yom Kippur. We know from all early church texts that James went into the temple at least once to render atonement in the Holy of Holies. Now that would be on the Day of Atonement. And I would think that's what the blasphemy charge has to do with. So we have a lot of things that can tie in there. Not many other people can tie anything in, and nobody knows what this means otherwise. Except they say the wicked priest was a drunkard because of this drinking here. Drink also and staggered. In the original Habakkuk, it's let your foreskin be uncovered, funnily enough. For the cup of the right hand of the Lord, has to do with the cup of trembling or the cup of vengeance, will come around you, and shame will cover your glory. This concerns the high priest, whose shame was greater than his glory, because he did not circumcise the foreskin of his heart, as Ezekiel says you should do if you were going to be a, anyway, it's very abstruse stuff here, a proper high priest, and walked in the way of satiety. That is, in the way of drinking his fill. But the cup of the wrath of God would swallow him too. To my mind, what that is saying is that he would drink fully from the cup of the wrath of God. And has nothing to do with the wicked priest being a drunkard. Taking that, the wicked priest being a drunkard, they say, well, it looks like Jonathan or Simon Maccabee were killed at a banquet or something like that. We were trying to decide which of the two were killed at a banquet. I can't follow the establishment theories on this, but something about Simon Maccabee now had to do with being at a banquet, so that means he was drunk. But if you want to look at the New Testament, you'll see the exact same imagery in Revelations. Look here. I've already told it to you, but I'll read it to you again. And you can see that we have it again in Revelation about drinking, and it has to do with divine vengeance, not being drunk. Let's see if I can find it for you here. Here it is, Revelations 14:10. And he also shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his anger. Well, it's exactly the same imagery as we just read. It has to do with divine anger. There's nothing to do with being a drunkard. So there's one other place, I think, too. Here. It's in chapter 16:19. And the great Babylon, which is supposed to be Rome in Revelation, was remembered by God to give her the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. Last column. And she will terrify you because of the blood of men and the wrath of the land, the township, and all its inhabitants. Habakkuk. The interpretation of this passage is the wicked priest will be paid the reward he paid the poor. Here we finally have the poor, the Ebionim. So the followers of the righteous teacher are called the poor. So are the followers of James in Jamesian Christianity, which is known as Ebionites, the poor. That's what they're known as. Because Lebanon is the council of the community, the dumb beasts are the symbol of the ones of Judah doing Torah. But just as he conspired to destroy the poor, again the Ebionim, the wicked priest again, so too God would judge him, the wicked priest, to destruction. And as to the same because of the violence of the township, the violence of the land, its interpretation is the town is Jerusalem, where the wicked priest committed his works of abominations, polluting the temple of God. The violence of the land relates to the cities of Judah, where he stole the substance of the poor, used for the third time. And finally, what use are graven images? Images of lying, craftsmen put in trust in such things. The interpretation of this passage concerns the idols of the nations, the idolaters among the peoples, which they create to serve and bow down to. But these will not save them on the day of judgment. So now we know that we're talking about the day of judgment. It actually says it. And in the Quran, the same word is used for the judgment day that Muhammad is always talking about, the day of judgment. Yom al-Din in the Quran, here Yom al-Mishpat. Look, there's no spirit in these idols. The Lord is in his holy temple. Be silent before him, all the world. Habakkuk 2:19. Its interpretation concerns all the nations who serve stone and wood, all the idolaters that we are facing. But the last times are going to be extended. But on the day of judgment, God will destroy all the servants of idols and all the evil ones from off the earth. So this Pesher has total confidence in God. Though they are seeing the destruction of everything they believe in, though the temple is falling, though the Ketim are going to take the riches, though the last times are going to be extended beyond anything that was foretold, though the righteous teacher has been destroyed and many of the poor have been killed, still God is in his holy temple, And God will take vengeance in the end. I think this group is watching the last times itself, either fleeing or about to be destroyed, has witnessed all of what's happening in the war against Rome. And in spite of all of what they've seen and the disappointment of all their hopes, they end up with this really beautiful, on the day of judgment, God will destroy the servants of idols and the evil ones. The evil ones here are usually the backsliders among the Jews, the evil ones of his own people, as it was said earlier. The evil ones are the Jewish backsliders. The idolaters are the non-Jewish idolaters. Habakkuk commentary. Put that with the Damascus document, you're in good shape. Let me do one more thing before we talk about the exam. Quick run through Psalm 37, because it parallels this not only in paleography, but also in subject matter. There's lots of material about Isaiah, which has messianic passages that we're all familiar with. I'll just read you one or two of those just to show you these commentaries on Isaiah. Isaiah is very important to them. Like you have here, for instance, Isaiah 11, shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, a branch shall grow from its roots. That's a typical Christian proof text. Interpret, this is the branch of David who shall arise at the end of days. There's the branch of David, the messianic descendant of David. Also, that talks about the visitation of the land. Also speaks about seeking smooth things in Jerusalem, the Pharisees, clearly. So there's a lot from the Isaiah commentaries. I don't have all of them here because this is an earlier version. And I want to go over to Psalm 37 before we finish up here. But basically the same things are spoken. Look at Psalm 37. Again, that's a psalm that speaks about the tzaddik, the righteous and the wicked. That's always the one they like to interpret. It begins with something about something perishing by the sword, famine, and plague. And then in line 8, don't be angry, the wicked shall be cut off from the psalm. The interpretation is, all those who return to the law, they're okay. But those who do not refuse to turn away from evil, they're okay. But those who are stubborn, they shall be cut off. I've told you about cutting off, and Paul talks about cutting off in Galatians. He means the circumcisers there. Damascus document talks about cutting off at the time of the visitations. This is the people who don't come back to the law. Wait for the law. Wait for the Lord. That we already had in Habakkuk 2:3. Wait for it. It shall not tarry. This is the congregation of his elect. We've heard about them. Sons of Zadok are the elect, who do his will. More, I shall look towards this place. This concerns the wicked. At the end of 40 years, they should be blotted out. We heard in the Damascus document something about 40 years' time, too. Interpreted, this concerns the congregation, or the church, if you like, of the poor, the Ebionites, the Ebionim, who shall accept the season of penance and shall be delivered from the snares of Belial. The wicked draw the sword, bend the bow, etc., 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 14 and 15. Something about Manasseh and Ephraim, again, it's hard to figure out what they're talking about. The wicked of Ephraim and Manasseh, who shall lay hands on the priest, again, the righteous teacher, priest again, the opposition high priest, who's the righteous teacher, and the men of his council. And in the time of trial which shall come upon them, but God will redeem them from out of their hands. And then, I think that has to do again with the last judgment, afterwards they shall be delivered into the hand of the violent of the nations for judgment. That is, the wicked priest and his people will be delivered into the hands of the violent of the peoples for judgment. The violent of the peoples, it says. Well, if you've read your Josephus, it's in the actual fighting of the war, is delivered to a group called the Idumeans. And the Idumeans are in league with the Zealots. And the Zealots invite the Idumeans into the city. And they rampage through the city. And they, take vengeance on the wicked priest, on Ananus. As I told you, they berate and who knows what else they did to his dead body, to his body, or before they killed him or afterwards. And they obviously, what do you do when, like in Custer's battlefield, when they mutilate the dead? They obviously mutilated his body, threw it out without burial. The Idumeans, whoever they are pro-revolutionary Edomites. Now, the Herodians are anti-revolutionary Edomites. There were some Herodian men of war, if you look carefully in the Josephus, that joined the revolutionaries, some who took part in the uprising. So to my mind, these Idumeans have to do with the men of war or violent ones who are pro-revolutionary. They're the ones who take vengeance on the wicked priest, and again, that's exactly what we have here. The violent of the peoples, these same violent ones, took part in the scriptural exegesis sessions in the Habakkuk commentary of the righteous teacher. Anyway, this has to do with the penitents of the desert who will live for 1,000 generations. That's in the Damascus document. So all these things are written around the same time. They make the same allusions. And all the glory of Adam shall be theirs. So we've heard about that in the Damascus document. Primal Adam ideology, probably. Anyway, something about famine. Some bad times that are going to be in the Jerusalem, which goes on in the war. Finally, and those who love the Lord shall be the pride of the pasture, 20b. This is the church or congregation of his elect, exactly the same as the Ibanim. So the Ibanim are the elect of God. They will be the leaders and princes and the flock among the herds. The flock among the herds, that's also in the Damascus document. And these other people have oppressed his holy people, and they shall perish like smoke. Again, something about the congregation or commune church of the poor. The Ibanim again, over and over again. They shall possess the portion. They shall possess the high mountain of Israel. They shall enjoy the delights of the temple. The others shall be cut off. The violent of the nations and the wicked of Israel, the backsliders, the sinners, the wicked ones in Israel, they shall be cut off and blotted out. So then finally, this concerns the priest, the teacher of righteousness, who established and built the congregation of something, probably the poor again. So the teacher of righteousness, James, as you know in Christianity, is called the righteous one, always the tzaddik, is where the teacher of righteousness, see, look, where we speak about the teacher of righteousness, the passage is the wicked watches out for the righteous and seeks to slay him. So the wicked is always the wicked priest, the righteous is always the righteous teacher. James is actually called the righteous in Christianity. That's his name, James the Just. Why is he called the Just? Why does everyone remember him as the Just? Because he was a teacher of righteousness of some kind. In any case, maybe that's not true, but these parallels are just a huge amount of parallels. But God will not abandon him, as we already heard, when he is, and will not let him be condemned, that is in the last judgment probably. But God will pay him the reward by delivering him into the hand of the violent of the nations, that again is the wicked priest, to execute judgment upon him, the judgments of wickedness. So again, the wicked priest will be delivered to the violent of the nations, Idumeans probably, to execute judgment upon him because of what he did to the righteous teacher and the poor. Well, I have a parallel of that I don't see any other parallel to. That's it for that document. But as you see, it's very similar to the Habakkuk commentary. You can see that. I think one or two things from the temple scroll, and let's see, we've got some stuff from the Isaiah scrolls here in Ramesh that I can pick out for you that might be extra stuff that would be of interest to you. The branch of David we spoke about, that's on page 467. Again, more about the last days, devastation of the land, the visitation. scoffers of Jerusalem, last days, the congregation of people that serve smooth things. It's all the same things in the Isaiah commentaries. Here's the temple scroll, but one of the most important things here is column 47 and column 48, which you shall not let things skin sacrificed to idols into the temple. Just a short distance away from what he said in early Christianity that James is banning from new converts, things sacrificed to idols. And then at the end it speaks about, well, at one point here in the temple scroll it speaks about you shall only take one wife among the lifetime of a king, and that shall be a Jewish wife. And Herod, as we know, took 10 wives, most of whom were not Jewish. So it's against this multiplication of wives. That seems to be an attack on Herod. And then, of course, we have the attack on niece marriage at the end. If I can find it for you. Don't know if I can find it for you because I don't have this one marked well here. In any case, in the temple scroll, there's a ban on niece marriage too, the same as in the Damascus document. Now, the temple scroll is different from the others because it's a very long scroll, and it is done in the first person. So it's like a collection of sayings of God done in the first person. It's sort of like a sixth law book, like Deuteronomy. And I don't know. One last thing in the MMT, I will show you. The one last thing in MMT, and then we'll go. MMT was something that everyone argued about until we got in lawsuits over because they were holding it back, and then they finally let it out. But Vermesh's presentation of this is pretty difficult to follow. But at one point it does have a whole section on banning things sacrificed to idols in the temple. Oh, here it is. I think it's on page 223, but it's very, very badly done. But something about the sacrifices of Gentiles. He's got it all mixed up with numbers. And concerning the sacrifice of Gentiles, we consider they sacrifice to an idol. And that's what James bans in the instructions to overseas communities, and this is being banned in these sections here. It's basically about Gentile sacrifices in the temple. Then the last section, which is what I think you did a better job than my book. I might be on this book. It's ridiculous. Where's MMT? Where is it? These are some of our words, page 193 in my book, concerning the law of God. And some of the works that we reckon as justifying you. So this is written to somebody, and it's about works justifying you, not faith. It has to do with Gentile grain in the temple, vessels of Gentile copper being banned. Concerning the sacrifice of the Gentiles, we say they sacrifice to an idol. So it's all about, this first section is all about sacrifices to idols not being acceptable in the temple. Later, it talks about the temple, line 34, the first section, being the camp. Rather, Jerusalem is the camp. Outside the camp means outside Jerusalem. Anyway, it talks about Jerusalem being the chief of the camps is basically what it's talking about. Line 69. Jerusalem is the foremost of the camps of Israel. So there's a lot of material in there, but the last bit is what's interesting here. It's very abstruse stuff, all legal stuff. It's in what we call the second section of this, the second letter on works rights. It's like Corinthians 1, Corinthians 2, first letter and second letter. It's all about the law of Moses and the words of the prophets and the blessings of the curses and so on. But towards the end of it, it says, on page 200 of my book, remember the kings of Israel, understand their works. Whoever of them feared the Lord was saved from suffering. Remember David. He was a man of pious works. He also was saved. We have David in the Damascus document. And finally, we wrote you a letter. So there was a previous letter, Corinthians 1, Corinthians 2, things like that, Thessalonians 1, Thessalonians 2. We wrote you a previous letter, Why are they writing this person? About some works of the law, I think that's the first letter that we were just reading, which we reckon for your own good and for that of the people, of your people. Now this looks like a foreign king they're writing it to. And I think it's a letter written, a Jamesian light letter, written to this convert we have in early Christianity in northern Syria, which has to do with the land of Damascus and resurrecting the fallen tent of David there. These are convert kings in northern Syria. Queen Helen is one of these convert queens. Another one is in Eusebius, he's the King Agabus. So they want to be like David. So it's instructing them how to be like David. This is so that you will, these are works of the Torah which will be for your own good and your people, meaning the people, not our people, but the people that are converting there in northern Syria. Then you will rejoice at the end of time when you find that some of our words are true. These will be reckoned to you as righteousness, as Paul says. Abraham's faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. No, these works of the law are reckoned to you as righteousness. You're having done what is upright and good before him for your own good and for the good of Israel. So I think it's one of these pious northern Syrian kings that they're converting. And we know in the war against Rome that Helen's sons are the two people who sacrificed themselves in the first battles when the Roman troops are coming up to Jerusalem. Her two sons or grandsons are the first casualties of the war against Rome. So we do have the involvement of these foreign convert kings in Palestine. And it's all in my book, but I can't go any further than that. As far as exam goes. Okay, I would like to say a few words, if I could, about the archaeology and paleography of the scrolls before we forget that subject. Since we discussed when the scrolls were found, what was found, the archaeology was done there, as I did mention by Father Roland DeVoe. And he did several seasons from 1952 to 56. Most of the work was done by paid Arab laborers, not students like yourselves. So often that is good or bad. I can't judge if that's a good idea or not. He never published officially his results. He wrote a book called Archeology and Paleography, and that wasn't even a written book. It was a series of lectures he gave at Oxford that they collected into a book for him and put some footnotes. But the official reports of his excavations were never done. And the materials that others could write from have been looked at, but a lot of them are lost and so on. The main point is chronology. Look, there is a settlement of some kind there. They say they found writing stands, even inkwells with ink in them. Whether they wrote manuscripts there or not, nobody can prove or not prove. The question is whether the caves are connected with the settlement. There are an abnormal amount of bathing pools there, and the water system comes down from a dam, that's man-made, and a tunnel in the rock that's all man-made. So the water is very important to them. If you know this area, water is very important. They have cisterns and they have actually immersion steps where and the immersion pools fit the Talmudic description of what a immersion dimension pool would look like. There are steps, you could say, for cleaning, but also for perhaps going down into them. So ritual immersion, that doesn't mean they baptized like Christians once in a lifetime or something. They were daily baptized. They were daily immersers, meaning that they immersed for bodily purification. It's all in the Josephus' description of the Essenes. I think that's the main characteristic of the archaeology. There's a big fort type structure, which has been argued over. Is this a military installation? Because it is in the center of the buildings. There is this big sort of I don't know what else to call it, but a fortress of some kind. I mean, it's not got towers and battlements or anything, but it's a big stone, structure.
And the only purpose, it seems to me, could be for defense and lookout. We've done work now from our expeditions from this university on the graveyards. There are graveyards associated with the settlement, and there's some. I think all in all, there's about 1,300 graves. Some digging was done in the graves, but after the rabbis got a hold of this area after the 6-Day War, they stopped all digging in graves, and I understand their concern. They feel that you shouldn't disturb the dead for scientific purposes, just like American Indians are concerned about that in this country. It would be nice to know more about these things, but there were some female graves, mostly male graves. Most of the grave orientation, funnily enough, was north and south. Now, in the Jewish religion, most of the grave orientation is towards Jerusalem, and from this area, that would be more like east-west. And Muslim graves point to Mecca. That would be somewhat north-south, but not like these were. There were some Bedouin graves that obviously got mixed in here because there's been a lot of work done on the teeth of some of the ones that were dug up. And you could tell that some of the teeth were people who had lived a rougher life in the wilderness rather than others more planting sort of people. You can tell from teeth, that kind of thing. And those graves did face towards Mecca, but most of the 1,000 or so graves look like Jewish graves, but north and south. And we mapped the whole graveyard. Not that it really matters, but what we did find, Cal State students found that. Noel was in the group who's been coming here with us every week. On the edge of the graveyard, we found this so-called mausoleum, or huge ceremonial grave of some kind at the top, something called a barrel enclosure. But it's clearly a very important personage. And that was facing Jerusalem. That was an east-west grave. So it looks like all the graves were centered. So for instance, if you want the map, here would be this promontory with this structure here on it, here. And here would be the Dead Sea. And then all the other graves were like this, lined up like an army, sort of. And so some say this is the righteous teacher's grave. Who knows what it is. There were some secondary barrels of, I think, a woman and a child. But in any case, I think that's, they haven't published those results, even I don't know, because I was not able to be in the publishing of it, even though our students found it. The main issue of the archaeology is the coin data. And the coin data gives you some idea of when this was inhabited. So the coins seem to go back to the period of John Hyrcanus. Now, we've studied enough now to know who John Hyrcanus was. And then they kind of hit a peak before the fall of Jerusalem in 63 BC to the Romans. And then there's a dribble of coins on to maybe about 40 BC or so, late mid-30s or something. Not sure exactly when it trails off completely. So the date on a coin doesn't give you a precise dating parameter. The date on a coin, as I write in Maccabees, Archives, Christians, and when I cover the archaeology there in great detail, only tells you that the coin was not dropped before the date. It doesn't tell you how many years after the date a coin was dropped by somebody. So, I mean, maybe it was dropped the same year it was minted, maybe it was dropped 10 years after it was minted, maybe 20. I mean, it's not really clear. But probably closer to the time of minting than far away, unless it's just an accidental sort of thing that happened in the course of time. But So coins aren't precise, but the curve of the coins, I think, is useful. There seems to be a break-off of habitation in the 30s BC until around 4 BC. We also have destruction layer around somewhere in the 40s, 50s, 30s BC area. Severe burning. Looks like an intentional destruction. And then in 4 BC, what happened in 4 BC? Death of Heron. The coins start reappearing again. People start coming back, it's rebuilt. And then it hits a peak in habitation up to the time before the war against Rome, when it's the most coins. Jewish revolutionary coins. From the first and second year of the war against Rome, and then the coins trail off. And this is the problem with DeVoe's coins. None of the coins, a lot of the coins have been lost, so we can't check ones that he didn't identify or something. So this is all very important information. Then there's another area not far from Qumran called Ein Feshka, which is Ein means well or spring, which is about a kilometer or two south along the Dead Sea, where fresh water came up out of the ground, probably underground wells. Arabs actually use that to the present day for swimming. And that's probably where the agriculture was carried on by this community. Well, that shows habitation in the 70s and 80s, even though there's a severe destruction layer with signs of fighting, given Roman arrowheads and things like that. After the coins trailed off from the revolutionary coins. Then there are Roman coins found among the ruins there later on. Seemed to be a Roman outpost of soldiers or something there. And then in the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 136, the coins start up again. The traditional interpretation, DeVoe and his colleagues, primarily Milik, but also DeVoe, was that there was an earthquake in the area that Josephus mentions in 31 BC that made the area uninhabitable, they claim. There's a crack in one of the steps in the pools that could be related to an earthquake, but we showed in our first expedition in the radar ground scan, we were the first to apply radar ground scans to the area, that in fact, from what was being recorded, there was only a local displacement of the ground. There was no earthquake fault line there at all. And in my book, Maccabees, I say that the earthquake is not sufficient to make a total abandonment of an area for 30 years. Because if they could come back in 4 BC, they could come back in 30 BC, 29 BC, 28 BC, or whatever. There have to be some other factors, and that's a correct interpretation of the scrolls would help you there. And I say that there have to be political factors that mitigate against inhabiting a certain area. And we see how repressive Herod was. And we see how antagonistic these people would have been to someone like Herod because of their antagonism to niece marriage and things like that, and divorce, and polygamy, all things the Herodian family indulged in to excess. So I'm not surprised that we found there was no earthquake damage at Qumran. Plus the burning in the first strata of destruction is much more severe than you'd think a stone building an earthquake would have caused. With deliberate, dishes thrown over, burned, and things like that. Signs of a deliberate destruction. So that's what's wrong. The establishment people are assuming these are peaceful Essenes, not involved in any struggle against Rome or the Herodian family. And that's the defect of their theory from the beginning. And there were people who followed a zealot hypothesis. Cecil Roth and G.R. Driver, who I mentioned in the mid-60s, who said that these were zealots, that there was a different group who came back after the earthquake. They accepted the earthquake, but then said a different group came back. I don't accept either of those hypotheses. I say the same group was here from the whatever it was. It has a development, but it was impossible in the conditions engendered by Herod to sustain that installation. It also turns out that Dead Sea Scroll materials were found at Masada. Masada is the fortress, some 40 kilometers or so south of Qumran, where the Zealots or the Sicarii did their final suicide in 73 AD, where 1,000 people committed suicide according to Josephus at the end of the Jewish War. And it turns out there were some Qumran documents found there. What's the reason one has such disrespect for what we call the consensus view? Consensus of just the people who got a hold of the manuscripts early, and therefore they and their students have the same view. But why does one have such disrespect for it? Because their explanation for the fact of finding Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts at Masada is that, some partisans went up and joined the defenders at Masada and brought some scrolls with them. I don't think that's a sufficient explanation. For instance, the copper scroll, they say things like, it's inconvenient. The Essenes wouldn't be interested in a temple treasure list, so therefore this must have been a different person who put it there. So they have these absurd explanations for what are straightforward things. This is a group involved in the revolutionary struggle against the Herodians and the Romans. And we see that in the literature. We'll see that in the literature. The problem is the consensus view has the opponents in the literature as Maccabeans. In other words, they think all these negative comments are being made about Maccabean rulers. It's the most amazing turnabout in interpretation of data that I've ever been witnessed in my life, which is why I've been so frustrated and zealous in my activities to try to get a more balanced view. And that's why I entered the struggle to free the scrolls, because I felt that at least if we could have free access to the scrolls, we wouldn't have a consensus dominated by who controlled the publication of the scroll. You understand all that? So that's really what drives most of it. But the coin data, I think, is interesting. The coin data, of course, under Herod, the earthquake was of no just something that Milik, DeVoe, and others seized on to try to explain the destruction. Was of no consequence at all in the interruption of habitation signified by the coin data. The most populous period is during the war against Rome, so more and more holdouts and revolutionaries and, a bit like Fallujah, more and more resistance people, ended up there. Now the question is, since DeVoe didn't find anything past year 2 of the war, he said that he found a coin of the Roman 10th Legion there. So he hypothesized that the Roman 10th Legion had come down this way in 68 AD. You have to read your Josephus, on its way up to the besieging of Jerusalem and destroyed the installation. My question was always, first of all, the people didn't live in the buildings. Buildings, whatever, the few buildings they were communal buildings and bathing installations. The people lived in lean-tos, tents, or caves. So just because Roman troops came by at a certain time, if they did come by and burned a few buildings, unless they garrisoned the place just like Fallujah again, unless you put Marines in that place, they're all going to come back. So the fact that they passed by there, whether they did or not, we can't say, would not have stopped revolutionary holdouts there unless they garrisoned the place. And certainly the rock structures high up as they went in the cliff faces, and the soldiers pursued them, they could always go higher. And the soldiers could never have caught them in the cliff faces. So they would have given up and gone on to Jerusalem. They wouldn't have left the garrison there until after Jerusalem fell. Now in the siege of Masada, as they besieged Masada for 3 years, they would have garrisoned that place. In any case, all this was to say, when were the scrolls put in the caves? The devout group say that the terminus ad quem, I think, to which it's called, terminus to which. The cross devout people, and everyone follows along with these things. The terminus to which, a quo is from which. They use Latin for it. Anyway, I may have that wrong, I think it's right. Is 68, because that's when he said that the 10th Legion passed by there. But then it turned out that the coin he supposedly found was wrong anyway, and he had to retract that. But the damage was already done. Everyone thought that the scrolls were put in the caves no later than 68. But the last coins found in the place are 136. And even if Roman coins were found in the 80s, down in Enfeshka and places, no one would have been using anything but Roman coins in the 80s. There was no Jewish government left. They wouldn't be using Jewish revolutionary coins. So that doesn't tell you that those are Roman soldiers dropped the coins there or didn't drop the coins there. See, coin data, unless you have a preconceived notion, is very imprecise. It doesn't tell you who dropped it or anything like that. If it doesn't clash with other data, then that's fine. But the problem what we're going to find in the Habakkuk commentary is that the Habakkuk commentary knows that Jerusalem is going to fall. And it doesn't necessarily have witnessed it, but it knows that they're all doomed. And so then what the theorists do with that is they say, oh, well, because they are talking about the fall of Jerusalem either coming or soon or whatever, it doesn't say it's happened. But it's clear it's going to happen. Well, many refugee groups, the ones who fled Jerusalem, you didn't get that far in Josephus, but one of Judas Galilean's sons or grandsons, called Menachem, put on the royal purple in 66 or so in Josephus when the uprising broke out, and he broke into the armory at Masada, which had been a Herodian installation, and he took it over, and his people remained there, obviously, and he went up to Jerusalem, and then other parties killed or stoned him in the party strife. So, in any case, after that, Josephus says his partisans fled Jerusalem, didn't want anything more to do with what was going on there, and holed up in Masada. Well, if the people who followed him could go to Masada and stay there and didn't take part in the fighting in Jerusalem, lots of other groups could have left there too, knowing that the place was doomed. Doesn't mean that they were pro-Roman sympathizers. And early Christians have a prophecy that early Christians were warned to flee Jerusalem after the death of James. It's called the Pella Flight tradition. It's in the early Christian theology books. So lots of groups knew that Jerusalem was doomed, and we had that prophet going around saying Jerusalem was doomed in Josephus. I mean, if you had half a brain, you knew that the Romans were going to destroy the place. So I think all these theories are theories made in ivory towers by very childish-minded people who have no good real experience of the world. And because they're at Harvard or Oxford or the École Biblique, people take their view as gospel. And nobody questions them until some mavericks like myself come along and cause trouble. And then everyone begins to maybe think more seriously about these things. So there's no final conclusions about this. As I say in my Maccabees book, the only real conclusion you can draw is that the scrolls had to be put in the caves before 136 AD. They could have been put in the caves any time before that. They didn't have to be put in the caves in 68 AD. They may have been. There could have been groups hanging around in the caves reading the documents in Cave 1 in the year 80, 90, 100. Who's going to be bothering them? Nobody else ever went out there for another 2,000 years anyway. Who would bother them if they wanted to sit up in some caves reading these documents? Nobody was going to go out there very frequently. And if anyone did come, I mean, they could see them a mile away and take off. So that's what I'm trying to say, that the archaeology doesn't tell you when the documents were put in the caves. It doesn't tell you when total just because the buildings were burned. If they were burned, it doesn't say that habitation ended. The two are not necessarily the same. The Enfeshka fields show evidence of activity in the 80s and 90s. So the archaeology, I would say, is inconclusive. All things being equal, if our documents agree with it, fine. But if the documents don't agree with it, then the documents take precedence over the archaeology. And if there's if the fall of Jerusalem is being talked about in the Habakkuk commentary, and that's why it's so important, we have to decide which fall of Jerusalem that is. See, the Orthodox consensus groups say, oh, well, it's not 70 AD, it's not Masada. Therefore, it's 37 BC, 63 BC, or the time of Judas Maccabeus. I mean, that's the other three falls of Jerusalem we have here. That's why we did the history, so you can make a rational choice. Well, when you read the Habakkuk commentary, I think you'll see that it's 70 AD they're talking about. And it's only this pseudo-scientific results centered around the archaeology that causes people to think otherwise. Then the paleography is similar. We have these sequences which, all other things being equal, may work. I told you about that. They try to date these manuscripts according to their analysis of the way given letters look and the developments and changes in given letters. We're talking about a very small time frame here, 200 years or so. We don't have any external controls. We don't have any external controls by which to check if we're right. We don't have any dated manuscripts from any of these periods to tell us if the assumptions that these people are making about their development of scripts, timelines are correct.
Can you define paleography? Is that
Paleography is the way a letter looks, handwriting.
Oh.
Study of handwriting. I couldn't even spell it. Some people put an A where
Is that styles or just letter usage or a bit of everything?
everything. The way, the analysis of handwriting and style or development of scripts, things like that. Look, Cross of Harvard was the one, invented by Birnbaum, as I told you. It's all in my Maccabees book. I have several chapters on this in both the Habakkuk commentary and the Maccabees Zadokites. Those essays are all in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. He's still alive, he's still at Harvard, he's still causing trouble. He actually identified the ossuary, the James ossuary recently as authentic, and then he took it back when he found out that others were questioning it. So these people they seem like experts because they're at these famous places, but it doesn't make them experts. It just means that they got a job when someone else didn't, and then they sit their whole life. And Ross followed this fellow I like to call Bird Brain, but his name is Birnbaum. And I criticize him quite extensively in Maccabees Anarchitis. And I give all the reasons for it, and I don't see any reason to take any of the things I said back about the way he tries to prove these sequences of script styles. Why did they develop these script style ideas? Because that's what they were following, these scholars. Here they bought all these things from Bedouin. They had a huge pile of rubbish here over the floor, this fragment, this fragment, this fragment, this fragment. And they began to be able to recognize handwriting styles. Look, if you gave me your notes, and I ripped them all up and threw them in a big pile here, and then I wanted to figure out whose paper was who, I could do it. Because I would just start looking at the handwriting and start making separate piles of the different handwriting of different people, because each of your handwriting is different. So I would soon end up with, 10, 12 people here, with 12 different piles. Then my only problem after that would be to try to, arrange the piles in some order, to try to figure out what you were saying in that document. But you see, they got very familiar with the handwriting styles, so they could see what they thought were either regressions or developments in different letters, the characteristics of the way different letters were formed. This may have just been idiosyncrasies of individuals. Look, if the sequences help and give you information, that's good. But if they stand in the way of the historical and internal data, then that's bad. And given the way the historical and internal data is, I say, the paleography and archaeology make it impossible to make any sense out of the internal data. Because the people who did the external measurements and didn't do the internal measurements, that is, paleography and archaeology, already had these preconceptions in their minds. So that's why I go so much on the text. We can say the same for carbon testing, which I was the one who proposed should be done. I wrote the letter, unfortunately, to the Ministry of Archaeological Affairs with another scholar I brought in, saying, well, if you're not going to release the scrolls, at least you can check. Well, they did, but they left us out of the process. So they were the ones checking the process. Sort of like the Shroud of Turin. But I don't think that dating the Shroud of Turin is reliable at all. I don't think their carbon testing is anywhere near what the date of the Shroud. The Shroud of Turin, to me, is not a 13th century forgery. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure it's not a 13th century painting. Carbon testing is only as good as the people analyzing it. I have a lot of comments in a recent article I did with some other fellows on the carbon testing, and what it turns out is the margins of error in carbon testing are larger than the period we're even talking about. So, they may help you, it may not help. We're talking about a 200-year period, and their margins of error are greater than that in the carbon testing process. I was hoping that you could test earlier versus later in the same test run to test paleography. That's not what they did. They tried to get absolute dates, and absolute dates are almost impossible to get. The same with paleography, almost impossible to get. So you're thrown back on the internal data. In any case, the carbon testing was skewed. Gave some agreement with their paleographic sequences, which made them very happy, but on the other hand, sometimes it didn't. And in any case, the margins of error are quite large. The example I posited last time, suppose you had two scribes writing side by side. One, an old scribe, was very conservative. One, a young scribe, was very progressive. What date would you give two manuscripts written at the same time? Well, you might be 100, 200 years out with paleography. So if they agree, but the paleographers are putting the Damascus document in the 2nd century BC. And I don't think because one fragment looks old. There's a whole cluster of what they call newer fragments. And then one fragment looks old. I don't see any way you can put the Damascus document in the 2nd century BC, given its references to the new covenant, the land of Damascus, and the various things we've been looking at. Community rule the same. Yet it's going to talk about the way in the wilderness and things like that. So from what we've been reading, it seems to me that these are more like 1st century documents, the sectarian documents. And when you compare one document with another, they all refer to the same people. So they all are basically written around the same time. They all refer to the same people, the same events. So you're not going to write a document 200 years later about someone who existed in the time of George Washington. You know, these are vivid contemporary commentaries. So anyway, let's hold those are the arguments in the field. The people who go by external data, the people who go by internal.